Well, good morning, everybody. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather this morning and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Thank you first of all to Dr Winter and everyone at AHURI for inviting me to be here this morning. Can I also acknowledge Christine Castley, who's the Deputy Director General of the Department of Housing and Public Works in Queensland. Importantly, can I acknowledge Senator Zazelja, the South Australian Minister, Zoe Bettison. Zoe, thank you for having us here in your wonderful state, and thank you for AHURI for choosing Adelaide. Adelaide's close to my heart. It's the place where my grandmother lived for a couple of decades in public housing, not far from here in a place called Greenacres, which I'm sure is familiar to some of you. On my way down here yesterday, my dad also reminded me that someone who might be familiar to many of you, John Girardi, who was a figure I think in SA Housing, led the Woodville SA NFL team that my father played for as well, and Dad insisted that I get that in there. Zed, Zoe and I share an extraordinary privilege. That is being a minister responsible in an Australian government to deliver housing for those people most in need. And Australian governments, I think we can all agree, have a proud history of providing for the needs of vulnerable people and working people as well when it comes to housing. Since the beginning of our federation, there's been an understanding of the importance of the delivery of housing to Australians most in need. And traditionally this has been an absolutely bipartisan approach. It's always been part of our national understanding, part of the social contract, the social safety net. It's one of the things that we as Australians say about ourselves, that we're not prepared to let others go without a roof over their head. But we all know that unfortunately too many Australians tonight will do just that. They'll sleep under a bridge, on a friend's couch. They might undertake some sort of risky behaviour just to have a place to sleep. And that's why I support those in the audience, and I support Minister Bettison in making clear our view that security of funding for those who work and those who run service provision in the homelessness sector must be a priority for the Commonwealth and states when we meet on the 4th of November. The safety net that I spoke about is under increasing pressure. Gone are the days where social housing was about delivering a home for the working class in this nation, people like my grandparents here in Greenacres. We now face the reality that the state provision of housing has to be focused on the delivery of shelter to the most in need. Now that shift is actually quite a significant one, and one that I feel that governments have become slow to understand. Social housing is now the ultimate safety net. It's the provider of housing to that portion of society that are least able to cope and least able to dream of a better future. Too often the net doesn't just protect you from the fall though. What we know is that it's now very, very difficult to climb out of. The idea that once in a social housing home that you're effectively set for life, that there is little future beyond social housing has become pervasive, not just amongst those who live in our homes, our tenants, but it's become pervasive amongst policymakers as well. And I think that such a view fails to allow for, and I think it fails to provide for aspiration. It cancels out the view that there can be hope for something better. Something better than a life dependent on welfare, something better than a life that is devoid of the dignity of work. For too long we have accepted the outcomes that social housing was an endpoint in people's lives rather than an enabler to do something better. Now, as I've met with public housing tenants, community housing providers, property developers and community leaders across Queensland, the thing that's become crystal clear to me is that we need to provide better for that aspiration. We must create policy settings that allow for the kid that grows up in public housing to dream of a better future. We must fight to ensure that policy settings that we make allow for the opportunity of that kid that grows up in public housing to dream of something bigger. We must ensure that policy settings that we do make do everything they can to encourage that kid to move up and not stagnate in welfare dependency. And when we think about the role of community housing providers within our system, we need to consider the downsides of Commonwealth rent assistance as a welfare trap, just as much as we consider it as a contributor to the business model. Now, we're all aware of the perverse incentives that we as policymakers over the years have built into the system. That in many ways we have made decisions that lock people into a system rather than provide incentives to move out of it. Now, as I've been considering the future of housing in Queensland, I've remained focused on ensuring that there is a pathway out for the hard-working, clever kid that grows up in one of those homes. I just want you to imagine for a second the kid that does everything that government and society expects of them. They work hard, they get good grades, they do all the things that society hopes and expects them to do. Now that kid gets into university, studies hard, graduates near the top of their class, and gets offered a job in my department, the Department of Housing and Public Works in Queensland. Now, their income isn't going to be huge, but the very day that they're offered that job, they're faced with an extraordinary stark choice. Because they grow up in public housing, they either move out or they put their parents' tenancy at risk. Now, I didn't have to face that kind of choice when I got my first job, and kids from normal families all over the nation don't have to face that sort of choice, but it's a choice that we force on the kids of public housing every day. There's a positive disincentive to aspire to something better. There is an absolute disincentive to achieve. Now, when we think about the future of housing assistance, we should be absolutely laser focused on that kid, that family, and that the impact of the decisions that we make as policy makers will have on them. Now, it's easy to talk about fairness, it's much harder to deliver. Take this example. Very few here have faced those decisions. I certainly haven't. But those decisions, I think we all know, are far too real. They're all too stark, and I think they're far more common than the community at large might like to consider. But it isn't just in setting eligibility policies or rent policy settings in general where difficult decisions need to be made. I think we've got to assess whether or not the system that we have built is actually fit for purpose. Now, I agree with the Senator. Over the past decade, we have gone backwards. There has been a significant shift in public housing policy settings from catering for the working class to delivery of housing to people in critical need. And the shift has dragged community housing providers from the provision of housing to what we would ordinarily describe as key workers to the provision of housing for those most in need. And that transition wasn't planned, even if it was foreseeable. And that transition has taken an important part of the housing continuum completely out of the equation. We continue to fail to provide the affordable housing step out of social housing. Now, we know that the acute need at that pointy end is quite large, but choosing to solely satisfy that need and that piece fails to deliver for those equally worthy but less acute people who need housing to allow them to live lives with stable and secure employment. In some ways, it's a Hobson's choice. Now, I think we've got to develop a sophisticated set of policy responses, recognising that for every person that you move through the housing continuum, you leave a space behind for somebody else. But to build that system, we need to build a genuine housing ecosystem. A housing system that isn't just focused on the provision of housing to those most in need, but one that contemplates the needs of people right throughout that continuum. And it's at this point that we need to consider the role of the not-for-profit sector in the delivery of housing. Now, if you flew down from Brisbane this morning, if you got online, you might have picked up the Courier Mail and read that it suggested that I'm proposing a radical solution to shift community housing providers into the delivery of affordable housing. Well, I want to respond to that, and I want to respond by firstly saying there's nothing radical about a proposition that shifts community housing providers back to the position in which they started in. Secondly, I'd strongly argue that provision of social housing is an essential service and so sits central to the role of government. The idea that government abrogate its responsibilities to those most in need is anathema to me. I'm generally surprised by the acceptance of what are fundamentally Thatcherist policies by people that would seek to portray themselves as of the left. It seems to me that too often these people pretend to be of the left until it becomes inconvenient to their personal or their organisational goals. Now, our government in Queensland and many others around the nation was elected on a platform opposed to privatisation. And privatisation is something that Queenslanders in particular have consistently opposed. People in my state expect the government to provide essential services. And that expectation extends to the provision of housing services to vulnerable Queenslanders. And I've been clear from the day I became Minister that we aren't going to continue with the agenda of mass transfer of housing management, and we aren't going to give away our homes either. And the myth of contestability in essential service provision is a legacy of Thatcher era new managerialism. And new managerialism was never about delivering better services. It never was. It was never about improving the lives of vulnerable people. It's always been about delivering services more cheaply. It's always been about the community sector being able to deliver community services at a discount rate compared to the public sector. And I don't accept that view. The transfer of housing from the public sector to the community sector can only be considered a success if you measure success in the number of homes that we shuffle from one sector to the other. It's a bit like the IT guy who works under the misguided belief that the company exists in order to keep the IT section employed. Or as Maslow said, if all you've got is a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And moreover, the whole thing is based on the idea that growing the sector through transfers was the key strategy of COAG reforms back in 2009. That's not what those decisions say. The 35% target for the community sector was supposed to be an increase in the quantum of housing overall, not just see a shuffling of management or title. I was reading a AHURI report, as we all love to do, recently released, and there was a quote in it. It said, "Balance sheet enhancement via giving large community housing providers greater control of managed assets will also be beneficial to growth and efficiency goals." And the question that I want to return to, and it's something that I've been raising in my discussions over the last year with the sector, is why haven't we seen this growth? From 2009 to 2010, we saw a pretty significant increase in community managed housing paid for by the Commonwealth through nation building funding. Around $4.2 billion worth of housing was introduced to the system. Yet since 2011, there's been no significant growth. And the question I ask is, why haven't we seen the billions of dollars injected into the sector's balance sheets leveraged to build more houses for people? Now, if stock transfers at scale are meant to be the silver bullet that unlocks that significant growth, at what point are we going to see that growth actually eventuate? Now, I think the stock transfer theory either doesn't work, or organisations have little incentive or too many challenges to make it work. Because what's clear from the figures and other speakers this morning is that it hasn't worked. The mass transfer of housing stock proposed by the previous Queensland government is a case in point. Had the previous Queensland government's first mass transfer scheme proceeded, we would have handed over management of 4,900 homes, including title for about 1,000 homes in the place that I call home, in the city of Logan. Now that's a pretty significant land holding in a place like Logan. But that growth proposed there lacked ambition to grow either social or affordable housing to keep up with the expected growth of the population either in the city of Logan or in the southeast corner of Queensland more generally. Now, Logan, as I said, where I live, is a fast-growing city with significant areas of high concentration of public housing. I think it's well placed for significant revitalisation. But 800 new homes in 20 years is a negligent lack of ambition. It would not have met those expected outcomes outlined by the Senator. If we aren't making up the affordable housing deficit through genuine revitalisation in a place like Logan, we aren't really playing to win. But I am playing to win, and I'm not going to vacate the field in the provision of housing for vulnerable people, because this field is key to the future of our neighbourhoods, our communities and cities across Queensland. So we will have a renewal program that will lead to more housing in Logan and around the state. We will be taking a precinct by precinct approach to redevelopment in Logan, partnering with industry to build modern new homes, and it will be consistent with the Advancing Our Cities and Regions plan that we've announced in Queensland, and that plan aligns with the Commonwealth Smart Cities plan as well. The redevelopment that we'll do will see a mix of densities as well as mixed-use developments, creating economic opportunity in local communities beyond housing. And while we will be building new public housing as a clear outcome, this will also provide a landmark opportunity for the sector to leverage off our redevelopment and secure more affordable housing. Now, we'll be partnering with Economic Development Queensland and other government agencies to look for other government land that can be included as part of this redevelopment program. And what I'm asking is that the community housing sector in Queensland come up with innovative, affordable housing proposals that can be included in this statewide redevelopment. I'm asking the community housing sector in Queensland to be part of the pathway of economic and social mobility for vulnerable Queenslanders. And I want affordable to actually be affordable and mean affordable as part of that program. Because I think the current definitions around affordability that we throw around have failed us. The 30-40 benchmark doesn't work, and I'm pleased to see the South Australian Government is doing something different. Benchmarking as a discount to market rent is also a failed definition. Affordable rental actually has to be affordable, not just cheaper than the neighbouring properties. And more affordable housing will allow a genuine pathway out of public housing so that people don't have to attempt to take that giant leap, bridge that giant gap to get to the private market. So in terms of my vision for the future of housing assistance, it's a system that provides very well lit pathways that allows people to move through the continuum. And this will be the focus of my new 10-year housing strategy, which our government will consider soon. And the success of these pathways will be predicated on our willingness to embrace what needs to be a radical shift in housing assistance, to embrace growth in affordable and public housing, and to clearly defined roles in this new environment. Now, if we succeed in establishing a policy framework, or this policy framework, we will succeed in creating a home for more vulnerable Australians. We will establish a housing mechanism to help people grow beyond the immediate need of basic shelter. And most importantly, and the reason I think that we're all here today, we will provide people with meaningful, life-changing outcomes. If we succeed, we'll unclog the system, giving people the ability to move along the continuum. We'll remove barriers that entrench disadvantage in our communities, and we will create a new era of opportunity for our young people. And I think these are goals that are worth fighting for. I think these are goals that are worth dedicating ourselves to. And I look forward to seeing the impact that we can achieve together. Thank you.